How do you lose control of a river without losing the river itself? And what if four muddy islands just exposed a weakness Moscow can no longer hide? If you want clear war analysis without the noise, tap like, subscribe, and share this video with one person who wants the bigger picture, because the next few minutes may completely change how you see the Kherson front. For weeks, most eyes were fixed on the big names of the war, the cities, the highways, the places that look important on a map. But some of the most dangerous changes do not begin on giant fronts. They begin in places that seem too small to matter. A cluster of islands, a stretch of water, a few boats moving through fog before sunrise. And then, suddenly, an entire defensive idea starts to crack. That is why this story matters. Reports from Ukrainian and independent reporting around the Kherson sector say Ukrainian Marines pushed Russian forces off four islands between Kherson and occupied Oleshki, Oleksievsky, Krulik, Korobolev, and Potemkinsky. On paper, those names do not sound like the kind of places that decide momentum, but war is full of moments where small ground changes everything around it, because these are not just islands. They are eyes, ears, launch points, cover, and firing angles. They sit inside the river maze that has defined this part of the war ever since Russia pulled back from the right bank and Ukraine retook Kherson City. Once the river became the front line, every patch of land inside that watery border became valuable. Whoever sits there can spot movement, guide drones, harass supply lines, and force the other side to burn time, fuel, and manpower just to survive one more day. So when people hear a title like Putin's river line just collapsed, the real question is not whether the entire southern front disappeared overnight. It did not. The deeper question is whether the method Russia used to hold this river barrier is failing. And if these reports are accurate, that answer looks increasingly uncomfortable for Moscow. To understand why, you have to picture the battlefield correctly. This is not a normal front. It is not long columns of tanks racing over open ground. It is a wet, broken, dangerous zone of reeds, channels, mud, trees, scattered islands, drone screens, artillery watchers, and boats that can become coffins in seconds. Heavy vehicles do not move freely there. Large formations cannot hide there. Even a routine resupply run can turn into a small special operation. That last detail may be the most important one. The commander of Ukraine's 34th Separate Marine Brigade described rotations to and from the left bank as many special operations that depend on bad weather like rain, snow, or fog. Ammunition and provisions, he said, are even delivered by air to some positions. Think about what that means. This is not territory that can be held lazily. This is territory held by nerve, timing, and constant improvisation. And yet that same commander said Ukrainian Marines pushed Russian forces off those islands, cut local logistics, and expanded what he called the kill zone. That phrase matters. A kill zone is not just a place where enemy soldiers are in danger. It is a place where movement itself becomes punishment. A road is no longer a road. A bridge approach is no longer a safe route. A staging point becomes a marked target. In this case, one key point he mentioned was the area near the Konki Road Bridge, where Russian troops had reportedly been clustering. If Ukrainian pressure has made that zone far harder to use, the effect goes beyond a few local skirmishes. It touches resupply, rotation, reinforcement, and confidence. And confidence, especially on a riverfront, is a military asset all by itself. Now here is where the story becomes even more revealing. The same broader reporting says Russian units in the Dnipro Delta have been facing a serious shortage of boats. A report citing the ETEC partisan movement said many of the fast boats in the island zone had been destroyed, mainly by Ukrainian drone strikes, and that replacements were not arriving. The description from their source was brutal. Almost no boats left, every trip onto the water a lottery, supplies failing, rotations stalling, and surviving boats breaking down from wear and poor maintenance. That is not a minor problem. That is the kind of problem that turns a river defense into a trap. Because controlling water is not like controlling a road. On a road, even damaged units may still crawl, reroute, or scatter. On water, if you do not have boats, you do not have mobility. If you do not have mobility, then nearby positions can become isolated even when they are physically close. Men can be only a few hundred meters away and still be unreachable. This is what makes the reported island losses so dangerous for Russia. A river line looks strong from far away. It feels natural. It feels permanent. Water seems like protection, but a river line is only as strong as the force moving across it, around it, and through it. If your boats are scarce, your maintenance is poor, your resupply is shaky, and the enemy can hunt the water with drones, then the river stops being your shield. It becomes your prison. And this is exactly why small islands matter so much more than their size suggests. In the Dnipro Delta, an island is not only ground, it is a relay point for observation. It is a place to launch or recover small teams. It is a platform for mortars, drones, or electronic surveillance. It is a pocket of concealment in a landscape where concealment is rare and life-saving. Lose one and nearby channels become harder to use. Lose several, and the geometry of risk changes across the whole local map. So what may have happened here is not just a successful raid, it may be a demonstration that the Russian side is struggling to keep this river system connected under pressure. That is what collapse means in a serious military sense. Not dramatic speeches, not social media noise, a breakdown in the ability to observe, move, reinforce, and answer fast enough. Now let's widen the lens. The Dnipro Islands around Kherson have been called a gray zone for a long time. That description matters because gray zones are where wars become exhausting. Neither side fully owns the terrain. Both sides keep probing it. Small teams cross, strike, withdraw, hide, listen, and wait. According to earlier reporting on the island battles, Russia used some of these islands to launch raids and direct fire against Kherson, while Ukraine tried to use them to push Russian artillery farther back and reduce pressure on the city. That means the fight over these islands is not new. What is new is the suggestion that Ukraine has pushed Russia off multiple islands at once and widened the fire control it can exert near Oleshki. If that holds, then this is not just another exchange of raids, it is a more meaningful shift in the local balance. And it helps explain the emotional power behind the story, because from Russia's point of view, the left bank after the retreat from Kherson City was supposed to be the more stable side of the river. Not easy, but stable. The river itself was supposed to help absorb pressure. The islands were supposed to complicate Ukrainian movement. The occupied bank was supposed to give Russia the shorter access to support positions from inland routes. But that logic works only if support can actually reach the men sitting out in the water maze. If boats are few, exposed, broken, or destroyed, then the side that seems closer on the map can still react too slowly in real life. The river becomes a barrier for both sides, not just one, and the force that adapts faster with drones, weather windows, concealment, and precise fires starts to gain the edge. This is why the boat problem may be the center of the whole story. Not because boats are glamorous. They are not. They are vulnerable, noisy, and easy to ignore until they vanish. But on this front, boats are everything. Boats mean rotation. Boats mean ammunition. Boats mean evacuation. Boats mean the difference between a forward team that can fight and one that can only wait. Imagine being a Russian soldier on or near one of those islands under constant drone threat. You hear the buzzing overhead. You know the channels are watched. You know artillery can be called onto the approaches. You know every crossing is risky. And then you start hearing that the boats are fewer, the repairs are slower, the replacements are not coming, and the enemy is expanding the zone where any movement can be hit. That is more than a tactical problem. That is a psychological squeeze. War often turns on that squeeze, not because one side suddenly becomes all-powerful, but because the other side stops trusting that the system behind them still works. A soldier can endure fear if he believes the route back exists. He can endure danger if he believes resupply will arrive. He can hold a miserable position longer if he believes evacuation is possible. But if those beliefs begin to rot, the position starts collapsing long before the last man leaves it. That is why I think the phrase riverline collapsed should be understood carefully. It may not mean a giant breakthrough tomorrow. It may mean something more serious over time. The internal logic of the defense is weakening. The line is losing coherence. The side holding it must work harder for smaller results. And every new problem now multiplies the old ones. Look at the pattern. Ukraine uses bad weather, stealth, and small unit flexibility. Ukraine relies heavily on drones and precise fire to punish movement. Ukraine appears to be contesting not just Russian positions, but Russian access to those positions. Meanwhile, reporting from the Russian side's occupied zone suggests shortage, breakdown, stalled rotation, and a growing inability to move safely on the water. Those two trends together produce the kind of local imbalance that can reshape a front without producing a classic breakthrough photo. And that leads to the next big point. If these islands are more firmly in Ukrainian hands, even temporarily, Ukraine gets more than symbolic value. It gets better observation over the left bank approaches. It gets more chances to spot gathering points. It gets more control over channels the Russians would prefer to use. It gets a better buffer for Kherson city itself. And it gets more pressure tools against Oleshki and the roads that connect local Russian positions. Notice what I am not saying. I am not saying this means Ukraine is about to launch a giant armored crossing and roll straight through the south. The terrain does not support easy fantasies like that. The river remains a brutal obstacle for both sides. Holding islands is hard. Expanding from islands is harder. Living on them under artillery, drones, and surveillance is miserable. Any force there remains exposed, but sometimes audiences make a mistake. They think that if an action is not the final breakthrough, then it does not matter. That is not how modern war works. Some operations matter because they deepen pressure. Some matter because they alter daily logistics. Some matter because they force the enemy to defend more places with fewer reliable tools. And some matter because they reveal what kind of future operation is becoming easier. This may be one of those cases. If Russia cannot move confidently in the Delta, then every Ukrainian observation post, drone team, and fire adjustment point on those islands becomes more valuable. Every Russian supply movement near the water becomes more dangerous. Every attempt to regroup close to the channels becomes more visible. And every decision Russian commanders make has to account for the fact that the watery edge of their defense may no longer function the way it was meant to. Let's take this one step deeper. Rivers have always tempted commanders into simple thinking. A river looks like a line looks like a wall feels secure. But in this war, a river is not a wall, it is a system. And systems fail when enough small links break at once. A drone destroys a boat. A second drone scares off the next crossing. Weather delays replacement. Maintenance fails. Rotation slips by days, then weeks. Ammunition arrives late. A forward team becomes tired. Observation gaps open. A bridge approach becomes too exposed. Troops cluster somewhere safe. Then that location gets registered and hit. Nobody wants to move in daylight. Night crossings become predictable. More drones appear. A river line does not die in one cinematic blast. It dies in fragments. And that may be exactly what we are watching now around Kherson. If this kind of grounded storytelling is what you come here for, press like right now, subscribe if you haven't, and send this video to a friend who is tired of shallow war coverage and wants the real logic behind the battle. Another reason this story matters is because it forces us to think about scale differently. 4 islands are tiny compared with a whole oblast, tiny compared with Crimea, tiny compared with the war itself. But scale in war is not only about square kilometers, it is about leverage. A small place that disrupts routes, exposes staging zones, and forces expensive countermeasures can matter more than a larger patch of land that changes nothing. That is especially true in a delta environment. Water channels narrow choices. Reed lines hide movement until the last moment. Electronics matter, weather matters, noise matters, timing matters. A cheap drone can influence a much larger area than the ground it physically occupies. A single observer with the right angle can make an entire route unusable. A unit that cannot be rotated becomes weaker every hour, even if it still technically holds its position. So when Ukraine reportedly pushed Russian forces off Oleksievsky, Krylik, Korobelev, and Potemkinsky, the military meaning was not simply, we took 4 islands. The deeper meaning was, we made your way of holding this sector more fragile. That is a much more important statement, and it may also help explain why this story hit such a nerve. Because politically, Russia has spent years projecting endurance, weight, and inevitability. The image is always one of depth, of reserves, of heavy presence, of lines that can absorb punishment. But this type of battle attacks a different part of the image. It says your problem is not only manpower or artillery. Your problem is adaptation. Your problem is that the battlefield changed shape faster than your control system did. On the Dnipro, old assumptions are especially dangerous. You cannot simply rely on occupying the farther bank and assume the water does the rest. You have to dominate the movement network inside the river itself. You need working boats, trained crews, repair capacity, cover, intelligence, timing, and the freedom to move without becoming instant drone prey. If any of those pieces fail, the others become harder to use. That is why reports of boat shortages and maintenance collapse matter more than almost any dramatic battlefield phrase. They tell us that the weakness may not be at the edge of the front line alone. It may be in the machinery that supports the line. And once support systems start failing, tactical losses begin to feel larger because they are harder to repair. Still, there is another side to this, and it is important to stay honest. Ukrainian gains in the island zone, even meaningful ones, do not erase the danger facing Ukrainian Marines. The same commander who spoke about success also described how hard it is to hold and supply positions there. Food and ammunition by air, rotations in bad weather, constant pressure. That tells us the battlefield is still unforgiving for everyone inside it. So the smart reading is not triumphal fantasy. The smart reading is that Ukraine may have found a way to exploit a Russian weakness more effectively in this sector, while Russia may be struggling to restore the local tools needed to reverse it. That is significant. But significant is not the same as easy. What could happen next? The first possibility is that Ukraine uses these islands mainly as fire control and observation positions, not as springboards for some giant headline assault. That would make sense. The value of the islands may lie less in launching a dramatic crossing and more in making Russian life on the left bank steadily worse. The second possibility is that Russia throws more effort into suppressing the islands with artillery, drones, and airdrop munitions, trying to turn them back into unusable gray zones rather than letting Ukraine turn them into semi-stable outposts. This is also likely. If Russia cannot quickly restore movement freedom on the water, it may try to compensate with more remote firepower. The third possibility is the one that should worry Russian planners most. Ukraine could use local control in the island sector to build a deeper pattern of surveillance and denial, not necessarily to grab huge territory, but to make the entire nearby defensive architecture less efficient. That means more strain on supply routes, more exposure around Oleshki, and more anxiety anywhere troops have to gather before moving forward. And remember something else. Kherson City is still close enough to feel the war directly. Earlier reporting on these islands stressed that Russian positions there help support raids and fire against the city. So reducing Russian access to the island belt is not just about future offensives. It is also about immediate protection and pressure reduction. That is why this battle is bigger than a map icon. It touches civilians, logistics, battlefield initiative, and the psychological contest over who can still shape events in the South. Now let's talk about the emotional core of this story, because that is where viewers often feel the stakes most clearly. There is something brutal about battles like this because they are so close and so unreachable at the same time. A man may be able to see the opposite bank and still have no safe way to get there. Support can exist in theory and fail in practice. A commander can know exactly where his troops are in trouble and still be unable to help them fast enough. Rivers create that kind of helplessness. They compress distance and expand risk at the same time. That helplessness is what may now be haunting the Russian side in this sector. Not because they lack weapons entirely, not because the front has evaporated, but because the water is punishing delay, and the systems meant to overcome that delay appear to be under serious stress. And for Ukraine, that matters beyond the four islands themselves. Because anytime you can make the enemy feel close to his own positions, yet unable to secure them, you are doing more than taking ground. You are attacking his sense of control. Here's the larger lesson. In modern war, collapse does not always begin where the line is loudest. Sometimes it begins where the line is thinnest, wettest, and easiest to overlook. Sometimes it begins with a shortage nobody wanted to admit. Sometimes it begins when cheap drones start deciding who can move and who cannot. Sometimes it begins when a river stops obeying the story one side has been telling about it. So yes, these islands are small, but the idea they challenge is huge. Final pause, and this one matters. If this video gave you a sharper view of what is really happening, subscribe now, drop your country in the comments, and share this with someone who still thinks tiny pieces of terrain never decide big wars. Because here is the ending that stays with me. Russia's problem in this sector may not be that it suddenly lost the whole river. Its problem may be that it can no longer use the river the way it needs to. And once that happens, every island becomes a test. Every crossing becomes a gamble. Every resupply run becomes a target. And every local setback starts echoing farther inland. That is the true danger of what happened near Kherson. If Ukrainian Marines really have pushed Russian forces off those 4 islands and widened the kill zone around Oleshki, then this is more than a tactical embarrassment. It is a warning that the left bank defense is vulnerable where it depends most on movement, not movement on highways, movement on water. Quiet, dangerous, essential movement on water. And history is full of armies that looked solid until the roots holding them together began to fail. So the next time someone tells you 4 islands cannot matter, remember this front. Remember that in war, geography is only half the story. The other half is whether you can still move through that geography faster, safer, and more confidently than the enemy. If you cannot, then the map you claim to control may already be slipping away from you in pieces too small for most people to notice. That is why these islands matter. That is why this fight matters. And that is why the river line may have started collapsing long before the headlines finally noticed.